Thank you, Alyssa. So we're going to get started with the presentation today. I'm so happy to be co-presenting with Tara Moffett, who is a partner at Gervin and Ferlazzo. Tara is now well, I'm not going to say is now because you transitioned quite a long time ago, but Tara represents many school districts in the state on special education issues, and she's a powerhouse of information and knowledge about rules, regulations, and laws impacting students with disabilities. And I have always found her to be an incredible source of student-based strategies and ideas. And I always welcome the opportunity, even if I'm sitting on the other side of the table of Tara. But we've had the chance to speak together or co-present many times, and I'm really honored to be with her today.
Well, right back at you.
I
was going to say, and I'd like to point out, Julie Keegan has been a long-standing advocate for individuals with disabilities, very knowledgeable about the background, the practice, advocacy, legal assistance, and representation, and has been committed to supporting both the mission of the Special Education Task Force as well as improving support services and access to programs, whether they be education through to adult and other federal and local programs for years. And we are very fortunate to be having her advice and input and opportunity to get her feedback on these exciting changes as well.
Thank you, Tara. I hope we both can live up to that introduction.
All right.
All right, so I'm going to share my screen now. Can everyone see that?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So Tara and I collaborated on putting this together, and I just want you to know that we understand that there's a wide variety of knowledge and experience with these issues of restraint and timeout in New York State, and so we are really doing an overview of the kind of core principles in the new regulations that came out last year. And so we're going to work on, let me just keep this moving. Well, Tara, do you want to go over the plan for the day?
Sure. I mean, basically, we're just going to kind of give you a very little bit of background, and then we're diving right into, there's a lot of updated definitions and regulations that we're really going to try to give you our best understanding of, as well as some explanation about what's new, what's different versus what have we already been used to, and then the additional requirements, which both from a district perspective and then from parents to be informed of and understand what those obligations are and why it's designed to promote and improve communication. Last, we do have a list of resources we'll be providing, and we will do our best to answer as many questions and answers as possible, with the understanding that this is still a developing area, and there's a lot of questions that are still being worked out, but we will definitely give wherever we have absolute responses, we will give them proudly and happily, and where there are issues, we can at least highlight what our concerns are and what we're trying to do to try to move through some of those challenges.
All right, so just to start us off, we're not going to focus so much on how it was and what it is now, because that would really eat up a lot of time. I think most of you want to know, where are we at now? But I did want to say that these changes that did occur were sort of a long time coming, and many people have been advocating for changes in the way that the use of restraints and timeout rooms were sort of being governed under the current regulations. There's been many efforts at the federal level for there to be reforms across all states. But finally, I'm going to say finally, in the fall of the summer of last year, we saw new regulations. Why is this important? Because the use of restraints and timeout can be very traumatizing for students. If there's repeated use of those interventions, it can be particularly traumatizing. And unfortunately, students with disabilities are at greater risk of being subjected to a restraint or being placed in timeout with some frequency. So some of the issues that we had identified and other advocates had identified, as well as school personnel, in in the former realm, I'm going to say, prior to the regulatory changes, was that it wasn't crystal clear that using a restraint was only for emergencies. Sometimes kids, and there was a whole series of articles in the Times Union about this, where kids are restrained hundreds of times in a school year and nothing is really changing. And so when we start seeing that kind of pattern, repeated use of these interventions, it begs the question of whether we're using that as a behavior management strategy versus only in an emergency situation. And I think that's the most important takeaway today, is that the new regulations really require that these be used only in in emergency situations. And we'll get into that in a little more detail. In addition, there was a kind of vague policy, requirement that schools have policies, but nothing prescribing what needs to be in that policy. Same thing, parents had to be notified of a restraint, but not necessarily the use of timeout room. The documentation around those kinds of interventions was somewhat vague, and didn't really spell out the reasons why we want to collect the information we do. And also, this is important, the importance of really reviewing what's happening for the child and in a particular setting. If there's a constant use of restraint, for example, why is that happening? In addition, the training requirements were vague. It just said, staff that might use a restraint need to be trained, but didn't say how often or what that training needed to include. And then finally, there was nobody really collecting information on how often restraints were being used on students, how often timeout was being used. The feds were sort of gathering this information, but the state wasn't. And that really showed a lack of insight, I think, because I think it's important for the state to know how often is this happening, and do we need to provide more training or guidance or funding or support to help students and schools, address behavior in a way that isn't using a very restrictive intervention.
I think that, Julie kind of summarized this slide in a lot of ways just through what she had highlighted. But I will point out that New York, while we still have room to grow, has been actually one of the states that actually has been more consistent on what is prohibited. We actually have a prohibition against the use of corporal punishment. There are many states, sadly 17, where there is still permissive corporal punishment in a number of them, and that they don't specifically preclude certain kinds of actions or physical contact with students. We have had some guidance, but it is always better to be crystal clear, particularly where you're talking about when and why and how we will intervene with students, and also recognizing this is not physical restraint in particular is not a behavioral strategy. And I think that there's been some confusion in the past, and we're working our way through that. And we're going to just kind of break it down. But I would say that last summer was the summer of understanding impact of discipline. This year really carries over addressing the discipline and removals, and looking more specifically at removals and how it is coming about, and what districts as well as our support systems are actually doing. So Julie, do you want to jump to the next slide? My control thing is a little funky. There we go. So you are doing corporal punishment, I believe? No, I am. Okay, just checking. Sorry, we were all set. All right, so corporal punishment is pretty well defined, at least in New York, to the extent that it relates to any kind of physical force upon the student for purposes of punishing. In other words, if you've got anger in your heart and you're using it on a kid, that's not good. On the flip side, there are limited exceptions. Our general rule is we don't want kids to be manhandled or, physically intervened with, particularly when it is not a crisis. There are behaviors that are problematic, and then there are true crisis behaviors where there is an immediate threat to the health and safety as opposed to a mere presumed or possible threat. And that's really the distinction as to what the difference is between corporal punishment, which is more a control and a I just come back to the concept of control versus certain limited permitted use of physical contact, which does have some degree of physical contact, but it is not physical force with the intent of punishing, belittling, harming, controlling, or manipulating. So we will look at the emergency use of physical restraint as a separate allowed category. But what is important is that you are not allowed to use corporal punishment. I mean, I don't think that we have any of those circumstances where we're talking about people, punishing kids with paddles and boards, but we do have to be mindful of things such as seclusion, which is a corporal punishment where the student is not being interacted with, and versus timeout, which is a specific approach and strategy. And we're going to try to walk you through those distinctions and help you understand the difference. Next slide.
I actually just want to add to that too, just on the last bullet on this page, that most of the reform has happened in section 19.5 of the New York Code of Rules and Regulations. And many of you might not be interested in this, but I think it's worth pointing out because I found it very troubling. And we actually commented on this when the regs were out for public comment. But before this, when people were looking at students with disabilities and the use of timeout and restraint, they were looking at Part 200 and specifically Part 200 or 200.22 of the Rules and Regulations, which deals with behavior type interventions for students with disabilities. And so everything related to restraints, which are called emergency interventions under that section, and timeout were there. And those were not changed very much. And 19.5 actually adds a whole host of other requirements and protections that were not also transferred over to the 200.22 dealing with students with disabilities, which makes it sort of confusing for practitioners because you really have to look at both. You have to look at 200.22, and in there it does reference 19.5, but it's really important that you know to look at 19.5 to get the real deal on what's required and what's not required for students with disabilities for the most part.
Right, and I think the one other important part is they've now codified the definitions to be the same, whether you're talking about the general prohibition against corporal punishment under 19.5, as well as carryover of those same definitions in our Part 200.22, which is an important thing to have that parity, because if you have different standards for when emergency physical restraint is permitted, it's problematic because people aren't necessarily understanding the distinction. And frankly, there shouldn't be one. There should be the same approach because our goal should always be to minimize physical contact and utilize other strategies and supports. All right, next slide. For some reason, it's not letting me advance on my thing. Okay.
It will on mine, but it
seems to be hidden at the bottom.
All right. So I'm just gonna go through physical and other types of restraints and sort of the new requirements associated with those. Tara's gonna chirp in when she can. We're both being mindful that we have a lot to get through. So we're going to kind of, again, just do an overview. So the first thing and the most important thing is to understand that we now really have a definition of what a physical restraint is. And what's key in that definition is it's a personal restriction that sort of keeps or prevents a student from moving their arms, their legs, their body, and their head freely. And that we have to think about that. So it's physical and it's restricting the student in a way that they cannot move freely. However, there are exceptions to that because there are times when we might put our hands on a student and it isn't and it isn't going to be considered a physical restraint. So the first example of that is a physical escort. And I'm really grateful that the regs, tried to define this, because it was always kind of vague about what that meant. But a physical escort is a situation, for example, a student does need to take advantage of a timeout room or some other setting, and they're going to be escorted by one or more staff to that setting. And in doing that, the staff may be holding the student in some way, their hand, their wrist, arm, to help them to walk to a location where they can de-escalate or otherwise calm down. So if that is happening, it's not considered a physical escort. To me, I'm going to not comment on everything, but I am going to comment on this one, because you can imagine a scenario where that sort of holding the arms, hands, wrists, shoulders could be pretty firm, especially if a student is really resisting that effort, and the student isn't actually able to break away and walk freely. So I still think there's confusion where this is concerned, but in a general sense, if someone, if it's like, hey, come on with me, we're going to go to the other room, and they're placing an arm, a hand on their arm, that is permitted. I just think the line of when that turns into a physical restraint may be a little blurry. The second,
one of the things I always try to remind people of is the practical application. Again, I look at a physical escort is a voluntary collaboration where you're moving together. The student may not be overjoyed to be, getting escorted to a different location, but they should be moving of their own volition with you there to assist them in ensuring they, arrive at the right location. You might redirect them, you might point them, you might have some, gentle forward, support, but there should be no pulling or dragging. It's kind of the best way I define that. That once you have a lot of force involved, you're no longer in a escort and you've crossed over into the restraint. So when we're talking about physical escort from the perspective of what I would look at for schools, there's got to be some degree of, student volition in terms of their movement, and you just happen to be working with them. You may be proximate, you may be in contact, but there should not be force of any, intent that is involved in that process.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear that perspective. That makes total sense to me, and I expect that was what was intended here, but it's not crystal clear either. The other exception, the other thing that doesn't constitute a physical restraint is obviously, supporting the student, putting your hand on them to guide them or comfort them or reward them or help them with a task or use hand over hand writing techniques, those kinds of things. That kind of touching doesn't constitute a physical restraint.
Yeah, I just want to comment on that one from an experience from the field. On that last one is that for the, assist the student, you kind of slip forward a couple. When you're assisting a student to, get up, because we do have some kids who might tend to flop, that kind of physical assist to help them up from the floor, so long as they're, engaged in that process, is one of those, brief physical contacts where you're assisting, them in the right direction. Again, avoiding the pulling, but certainly, some degree of assistance to get them in the right position to help them get back up.
Right. So another kind of restraint is a mechanical restraint. And mechanical restraints are those where we're using some kind of a device or equipment to restrict the student's freedom of movement. Those kinds of things, if it's being used specifically and deliberately to restrict the student's freedom of movement as a behavior intervention, not permitted, can't do that. But there are, again, like the physical restraints, there's exceptions to that, are things that don't fall within the definition. So that would be those devices that are prescribed for the student, and usually by a medical professional, or maybe an OTPT or speech professional has said, we're going to use a weighted blanket, or we're going to use footrests and or adaptive seating, and those are used to assist the student, and they're used for the purpose that they were intended for. It's when we start getting into using things like, I think Tara gave me an example yesterday of a Rifkin chair, which can provide a student with stability, and you strap that child into a Rifkin chair, but it's to allow them to sit up, maintain posture, and provide support. And if we're using that appropriately so the student can participate in an activity or receive instruction, that's fine. But if you're doing it to confine the student because they're acting out behaviorally or whatnot, then we're out of the realm of it being within the intended purpose. So there's differences there. So it is okay to use mechanical equipment or devices as long as they are medically appropriate and are being used for their intended purpose.
Right. The way I give I like to interpret state ed to hopefully make it more practical for people, just to help you understand. If it's for body positioning, support, alignment, making sure that they're in the ready learning posture and it's prescribed or it's part of the equipment that they're using, yay. If it is not, or if it's something you're adding, or if it's a situation you're creating that is not part of the original design, then it either better be pursuant to medical, prescribed treatment or therapy, or it is potentially going to cross that line. And that's where, the example that I had given was a chair that had the belt as part of it, and the student needed that mechanical support to just make sure that they stayed in the right position, versus if someone is adding it. Or another example was if the student's in a chair and you shove the chair up so tight that they're right up against the desk, so that for they, are unable to kind of slide out or get out, that is a use of, what would be a mechanical restraint, even though it doesn't involve, a specific equipment. You're using property in a way to limit that, as opposed to guidance, reminders, direction, support, or other things. And that's what, ultimately, when we're looking at mechanical restraint, if it's something to protect the safety of the student, harnesses, bus seatbelts, helmet, if they are, seizure prone, that's a appropriately used mechanical restraint. It's when we get creative that's where there's potential problems.
Right. The third kind of restraint that's discussed in the regulations are prone restraints. And a prone restraint means that the child is placed face down. Those are no longer permitted under any circumstance, even an emergency circumstance. No prone restraints. I think the picture here illustrates it. George Floyd was subjected to a prone restraint. Those are the kinds of things that interfere with people's breathing, and they're not permitted. All right. So in addition to the fact that we can use a restraint only when there's imminent danger of serious physical harm, and I am stressing the physical harm. In the prior regs, if there was harm to property, if there was a danger of there being a risk to property, it was okay to use a restraint. So the reforms really target this and say there needs to be an immediate danger of physical harm. So that's the most important thing.
And they expressly eliminated the use of physical restraint in order to address or protect property.
Right. So in addition to that, it has to be the least restrictive technique that's available. So if the student has a behavior plan, for example, and there are other calming techniques that work with that student, those are the things that should be used first. This is a last resort in an emergency situation. And it can only last as long as that danger is present. Again, no prone restraint or any type of restraint that would restrict a student's ability to breathe or communicate or otherwise harm the student. As we already noted, it can't be used just because there's a threat to property, unless, for example, student is threatening to smash into a window, like, for example, we're restraining the student because we don't want them to injure themselves by the act of punching a window or going through a window, not because the window might be damaged. Other really important thing here, only trained staff can administer a physical restraint. And we're going to go into a little bit more detail about that training. And if the student is injured, or if there's the possibility that the student was injured during the restraint, then the school nurse or another medical professional has to check out the student right after it happens.
I generally recommend the proactive measure, which is check them out anyway, just for your own safety. Because again, you might have a student who doesn't have the ability or the capacity to identify or recognize that. So it's always best to have that medical professional take a look.
All right, so one of the things I mentioned earlier was that the documentation for the use of restraint and type, there was in 200.22, there was a requirement for documentation of a restraint, but the new regulation is much more clear about what has to be documented, and who has to review that documentation and who has access to it. So first of all, a school has to document every incident. So every time a restraint is used, it must be documented. That documentation obviously includes information about the student, including on whether that student has an IEP, a 504 plan, and or a behavior intervention plan. It also has to document everyone involved in the restraint. So that could be the folks actually implementing the restraint, and that would be important information because they have to be trained in order to do that. But also people who may have witnessed it or knew what was going on at the time, because that's going to help inform how to prevent this from happening in the future. Information about the duration of the restraint, the type of restraint used, and importantly, what was done to try to avoid the restraint, what kinds of interventions were used, and were they consistent with the student's behavior intervention plan, if they have a behavior intervention plan. And that's really important because, again, we want to assess, was this necessary? Were there steps that could have been taken to avoid it? Are there things we need to build in so we can prevent this from happening in the future? And then on the form, it also has to document that parents were notified and that there was a debriefing meeting with the student. And I'm going to talk about those right now.
Okay.
So when the document is created, well, not quite right now, I'm going to talk about this, and then I'm going to talk about those. But this is really important too, that every time an incident is documented, and it has to be every time there's an incident, it has to be reviewed by supervisory personnel. And they're looking at the same things I was just talking about. Is this information complete? Was it necessary? What strategies were used or not used? But it also requires, the new reg requires that a school administrator or someone that the administrator designates is regularly looking at all of the reports and documentation of all of the restraints. And that is really important because we want to see, are there patterns? Are there patterns with this particular student? We're seeing this is happening more than it should. And obviously what we're doing isn't working. But there may be other patterns too. It may be in certain classrooms. It may be around certain staff. We definitely want to be looking at the patterns of what's going on in the school around restraints and how often they're being used, where and when they're being used, and by who. All right. And then we want to get into parental notification. And this is really important because as an advocate for students and for students through their parents or directly for students, a lot of times in the past, parents didn't know that their child was being restrained, or they might have known, but they didn't really have a lot of information about it. And they would sometimes, if they knew that the restraint had been documented, that they could ask for that information, but it wasn't all very clear. Now it's very clear. So every time a restraint is used, the school has to have a procedure in place to make sure that the parent knows that occurred, and it needs to happen on the same day. And that's important for a variety of reasons, right? You're going to have a student come home who may have been subject to a restraint. Obviously, the parents want to know about what happened. They want to be monitoring the student in case there is some kind of delayed type of injury or manifestation of injury. And they should be involved so that they know this is happening, and maybe more advocacy is needed on behalf of that student. If the school isn't able to reach the student, the parents that day, they have to document all of the efforts they made to notify the parent. And they also have to notify the Committee on Special Education if the student is, well, maybe that's not so.
It would be if the student is a student with a disability. You might have a student who's not a student with a disability, where there might have been an emergency restraint that is utilized because of an imminent threat to safety. So you would document your efforts, and if they are classified, you notify the Special Education Committee. Again, it's just to ensure that there's awareness of this, the need for a restraint or the emergency intervention, and then the continued review about program support services, staffing, and training, so that you're monitoring that to try to work on addressing the bigger issue, which is the behavior that results in a crisis situation is triggered by, something other than the desire to, be restrained. It has to do with communication. It has to do with problem, frustration, et cetera. And we have to work on those issues to try to avoid getting to the point where that student reaches that crisis level. And I've seen a couple of questions pop up in the question box, and I'm checking in that we'll circle back and respond on that. But one question came up was, what constitutes repeated use of restraints? Again, it could be you might have multiple incidents where the student escalates to a safety issue, an immediate threat is there, and then the student de-escalates, they get back to task, and then another episode arises. And that would be 2 write-ups, 2 documentations of those 2 separate incidents that would be there. So whether it's repeated depends on if you have an end to one incident and the beginning of another.
Thank you for that clarification, Tara, on both things. So, and then the parent also has to be provided with a copy of the documentation. And that's not optional, and the parent doesn't have to request it first. It has to be affirmatively provided by the school district to the parent within 3 school days. So that's a very much stronger effort and requirement to make sure that parents are aware of what's going on. And that also leads to this next section, a new requirement. This was not in the law in any way, shape, or form prior to the change in the regs, is that there's the debriefing requirement. And that first requires that after every single incident, that school administrator or someone that they're designating is meeting with the staff who were involved with it to talk about what happened, the who, what, where, why, when, and to talk about how can we prevent this from happening again, or at least reduce the likelihood that it may happen. And if it is a student who doesn't have an IEP, maybe they have a 504 plan or nothing, whether it would make sense to refer the student to this CSE, or whether if the student does have an IEP or behavior intervention plan, does that need to be updated? It's really important that this step takes place. I think this is a huge protection for students, and should be a relief to parents, honestly, that they are able to do this, and that these conversations are going on. And then the second requirement is that there has to be a school staff who sort of debriefs the incident with the student. Now that debriefing is going to vary greatly depending on the age of the student, the needs and communication of the student, their ability to understand what happened. But a lot of times, even when we're conducting functional behavior assessments and thinking about appropriate behavior interventions, we don't always include the student. And in fact, the student often has insight about what happened and may need to process that. So Clearly has to be done with care, but is something that could be very helpful to the student. And I'm realizing that I forgot one thing, and I just want to go back to the parental notification. There's an opportunity to meet. So the parent has to be offered an opportunity to meet with the school after a restraint. And I just want to say, from an advocate standpoint, I think that's a really great opportunity that parents should take pretty seriously. First, it allows you to get much more insight about what happened, and allows you to ensure that what happened was appropriate, that de-escalation techniques or other techniques were used, that the plan, if there is one, was being followed, and that it wasn't longer than it needed to be, whatever. It allows you to ensure some accountability, that the protections that are in this new regulation were used. But second, it allows you to have more understanding of what the school is experiencing with your student, and may create an opportunity to brainstorm, or brainstorm about other interventions, or provide more insight, such as, wow, when he left for school, he was really upset today about so-and-so. Those kinds of insights can be really helpful in trying to figure out how are we going to prevent this from happening in the future. So that is all on restraints, and I probably went over time, but that's okay. I'm going to turn it over to Tara now to talk about timeout.
All right, so let me try to go to the next slide, or can you go to the next slide? Sorry, I just somehow started drawing on it, which was not my intent. Okay, so timeout is a behavioral management technique. So this is different from physical restraint, which is not a strategy or approach. It's what you hope doesn't happen. But timeout is one of our strategies that we work with students, and we recognize that they may need a different space or the opportunity to regroup and recoup. And if that is the case, timeout, oops, we got to go back one slide because I didn't finish that one. So timeout's only permitted for the emergency use. Okay, timeout, what it is and what it isn't. Timeout is not the student requesting a break. To me, and both the practical application is, if we've trained the student when they need a moment to take a break, go get a glass of water, take a short, 2-minute walk in the hall. That's a strategy we've taught them so that they can regroup, recoup, and remain in class. And we've determined that using that strategy is more effective than having to have the student removed. Sensory room, when the student leaves to go to another space where there's coping tools or activities to help them calm and regulate, and they're using and engaging in that, that is not a timeout. That is the student using, again, a strategy we've taught them that helps them re-regulate with the plan, and it should be timed or limited, to get back to class. And then, our 3214 teacher removal in school suspension or other disciplinary action that is consistent with Education Law 3214 are not timeout. What is timeout is when we have a location that is, set and meets a number of requirements. It's got to have the appropriate space. It has to have constant supervision. And it is a monitored situation where the student is in a non-locked room. Many districts or programs have doors that may lock from the outside or may only be open from the outside or what have you. That is no longer permitted. So if you have any locking feature that needs to be eliminated or removed, but if you have them in a non-locked room where you're observing, and that is the opportunity for them to regroup, de-escalate, and hopefully then get back to a regular pattern and return, that is timeout. It is something you should be documenting: when, how often, how long, and all of those components, and we'll get to that. But that is timeout. Seclusion is when no one is, watching them, they're not being supported, and they cannot leave. That is the exact opposite of timeout. Timeout requires constant monitoring, possible engagement, and the student's ability to exit. Seclusion is the opposite. So to me, that hopefully is a clear enough definition and sort of giving you some practical examples there. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so again, just like physical restraint, timeout should be and emergency type response, because it is not for every, challenging situation. It's for those where that student's continued presence in the location may be unsafe, and that's why we've determined that they need to utilize the timeout, as opposed to our other strategies or supports that we could be using right there in the classroom. If the student has the ability to stay in class and sit in the beanbag chair on the side, but still can listen and participate, they don't need to go to timeout. But if they're unable to do that, we might need to look at timeout for that separate space or environment. Important things for students with disabilities: timeout should only be used as part of a behavioral intervention plan. And again, BIP is all about taking the problem and trying to resolve it by teaching the student replacement behaviors, reinforcing their use of alternatives, and getting them, to adapt to or respond in a more typical or safe way, so we don't have to continuously address that. The IEP, if you are using timeout, needs to reflect timeout, and it should also include the maximum time that that student will be in timeout. We will also come to the point where we talk about the policy, where you also have to have like a district-wide maximum amount of time, but you might need to individualize how long is timeout effective for a particular student, based on their age, their developmental abilities, their responsiveness, and whether or not there's, we're seeing the results and this is working towards helping get the student on track and then back into the program. Parents, again, we have that notification on the same day for when it is used, but also before you start with using timeout as a possible emergency intervention, it has to be discussed with the parents. The parents also have the right to see the space that will be utilized and to get a copy of the school's policy on timeout. This is where those definitions and updates to be more consistent with the new regulation is so important, because your policies, if you already have one, may need to be updated and reviewed if you're a school district. And if you're a parent, you want to know what that room or space or location might look like. And so that gives you that information. And the difference between seclusion and timeout is the monitoring and trained staff. The trained staff, it means that the person who's going to be observing, monitoring, or watching understands and has had training both on the effective and appropriate use of timeout, and also the required documentation, including start and end time, what other strategies were used, and making sure that the notice is still given to the parent. Once the student is in a good state, they should return to their program. The purpose of timeout is to avoid having to have students necessarily go out or be out on a disciplinary removal, when our hope is that they will regroup and be able to return and re-engage in their program for that day. So what goes into your policy and what's a requirement for physical space? One, unlocked. Cannot stress that enough. And that also means you can't hold the door shut, locked. And yes, I have talked to the state on this, and they basically say if you're holding the door or the child is unable to exit because of a blocking, then that potentially goes and crosses into either a physical restraint or a seclusion, depending upon if there's student contact. So I just give you the parameters, and we'll still talk about the practical issues. Staff must be able to see and hear the students at all times. That means it can't be a room with no windows, no doors, no lights. You need to be able to see them, and they need to be able to see you. One, for the assurance of the students, and two, this is also part of our obligation to supervise. It needs to be large enough to be comfortable for them to move or recline, and you need to make sure that you remove items that are potentially dangerous. Most timeout spaces are either they don't have a lot of items in that room. They might have a chair, they might have a desk, they might have a beanbag, but there's usually not a lot of items. But you have to be mindful of sharp corners or cabinets or other things where, if the student is having an episode, might become dangerous. And also has to be appropriate lighting, adequate ventilation space. I'm going to touch base on the lighting piece, because I want to highlight the difference between time out versus having the student go to a designated location where they're using a particular strategy or resource to regroup. Some districts have like the calming sensory zone where the student will go, and they might have reduced lights, they might have quiet music. That is different because they're still using a strategy. But if they're using it as an avoidance technique, that's why you have to keep track of how much time people are coming and going. But it really has to be part of a strategy as opposed to just a different location. And it has to have appropriate lighting. Sorry, go ahead. And this again goes back to the documentation. The documentation is very specific. This is the list of what your documentation has to have, and you'll note that it is the same list of required steps and documentation as required for physical restraint. So there's nice parity that you have basically the exact same requirements. And the reason why they added these additional components was, one, they wanted to track to figure out, are we using timeout or restraint more for students with disabilities as opposed to non-classified students. The setting and location is important because we need to know, is there any patterns? And that's part of that debriefing and de-escalation review. Is it happening at the same time of day? Is it happening, involving the same factors and staff? So this is where it all becomes part of that process. You need to identify who's involved in the event. And this also comes down to our review and monitoring. Are we having enough people respond? Are we having too many people respond? Knowing who was there and how quickly things resolve or don't resolve is important to determine how we staff, support, and program appropriately. Describe the incident, in particular, the duration. The amount of time a student is out in timeout becomes directly proportionate to how much instruction they're missing. And again, timeout is designed to be a response that will hopefully allow them to stay and return. So our goal is to make sure that they do go back and return, and that's why you have to keep track of it. And the positive proactive strategies before you get to timeout, this again, timeout or physical restraint are your last efforts. They're not the first option. And so we really should be looking at other strategies and supports that can be handled through classroom management, curriculum instruction, engagement, the planning, the pre-setting, the transition supports. All of those components go into it. And ideally, many of them were tried before we got to that use of timeout. And then again, parent notification. And then last but certainly not least, the staff debriefing. So as Julie had hinted upon it, there are requirements that we have the school administrator who's going to be involved in both the debriefing, and then they also have a separate requirement. Their administrator or the designee for the district or the building will be reviewing all of the use of timeout as well as restraint as that policy is required to determine if we need to do anything different, training of staff, support, timing, scheduling, pre-setting, other strategies to make sure that these are being used appropriately as the emergency intervention that they were intended to be, and not as the primary intervention or attempt as behavioral control. Because while timeout is a permitted behavioral intervention, it should be not the first intervention. It should be the emergency intervention when regulating them right there or where they're at is not effective, and you need to have a different environment to get them back on track. Okay. I covered the parental notification, so I'm just going to skip to that slide. We're moving ahead. So additional requirements related to the use of restraint and timeout, and this is really where we're going to get into the new components. So schools have had a requirement that they have a policy, but I would stress that not every district has had some of the level of detail that might be helpful, such as identification of the factors that might lead to the use of a permitted restraint or timeout. And when I say permitted, I'm not saying the encouraged restraint, but the permitted emergency use of that physical intervention is allowed if there is the immediate threat to the health or safety of the student, of others in that classroom, teachers, staff, or others. Let's say they're not in a classroom, but they might be in an auditorium where there may be other individuals, including visitors to the school. That immediate threat to the health and safety, and again, imminent, not it could happen, not we're worried that, but it is about to happen. And if I do not physically intervene, that injury is, goes from a risk to a potential reality. That's what kind of incidents should be listed there, both for timeout as well as for policies on the use of physical intervention. Appropriate time limits when you're using the intervention. For physical restraint, we don't have a requirement to put the appropriate time limit because there shouldn't be a prolonged restraint. Usually the restraint is only as necessary for the duration of the time it takes to remove the others from that environment or the student from that environment to get back to the point where you have control over the safety, and that would you go back. But when it comes to timeout, you have to have a plan as to what is effective and what isn't. And that's why you need to have that age and developmentally appropriate time restrictions. No locked rooms, no prone restraint. And, again, we still want to make sure our parents are aware about our policies and documentation, and they must get a copy of your time out room policy. I would say if there has been, or, if there has been use of physical restraint, there should be discussion with the parents to help them understand the documentation, what's going on, and how, for me, what other approaches, strategies, and supports were used prior to getting to that physical intervention. And then the last is still the pattern of use and monitoring, which now is at a district level instead of just being handled in, a CSE arrangement where they're reviewing. This is looking at it from a district based on the data and the data that they're reporting to the state, which also helps with making sure that there's both the accountability and also an awareness of the frequency in which these particular approaches are being utilized. Staff training. So again, Julie highlighted that originally the definition of what training was required has been about as, clear as mud, which is the staff must be trained in the district's, approach. But there's no state required particular approach, training methodology, or strategy. So each district has to determine what that training is, but that should include evidence-based, positive, proactive strategies and de-escalation techniques. How do you respond when a student is, unruly, defiant, or non-responsive? How do you determine if it's a crisis versus a nuisance or a concern? And understanding that you need to have a different level of response for the different approaches and the different presentation of the student. Understanding that there is only a limited permitted use of physical restraint in the event of that absolute immediate likelihood of threat to injury and safety. And timeout, again, has to be in the designated space that has been approved because it has to meet all of the specific parameters of the regulations. And anyone who may potentially be used to implement or oversee the implementation of timeout or physical restraint has to be trained on the evidence-based, safe and effective and developmentally appropriate physical restraints. The way I break it down is there's two trainings, one for everyone, the entire school, so that they understand these policies and practices, and a more substantive training for those who may be called upon to do the physical restraint or to oversee and supervise and implement the use of timeout. And yes, these regs apply to all students, so I'm going to answer that
one. So I know many of you are concerned about, okay, this is happening to my student. I don't know what to do about it. I'm trying to have conversations. What is out there for me? And I have to tell you, that's probably a whole day training in and of itself. And it's beyond what we can cover here today. But there are resources for that. And I will tell you that this special ed task force is in the final draft of a plain language guide on the use of restraints, timeout, as well as other behavior intervention supports, such as a functional behavior assessment, behavior intervention plan, and other things. I really expect that to be released, and you will all be notified when it's released, probably within the next month. That's my goal, maybe a little sooner if we can get it there. But that really goes through a lot of the different types of behavior, more positive behavior interventions, so that we're not using these kinds of intrusive interventions. But obviously, talking to the Committee on Special Ed and looking at a child's IEP and thinking about, are there any supports this child needs? Do we need to evaluate more through a functional behavior assessment? Do we need to update a functional behavior assessment because it's not working? The behavior plan is not working. Do we have to think about other supports for not only the student, but for the classroom teacher and the other individuals who are supporting the student in the classroom or outside the classroom? Maybe training for them, having someone provide assistance to the child. A lot of these require resources that schools have difficulty finding these days. but still are important supports that that school staff can benefit from. I mean, I have never met a school staff who enjoys using a restraint. It's very traumatizing for them. And there's a lot of documentation about this. I don't think anybody wants to put a child in a situation where they have or wants to respond with a restraint or the use of timeout as it's defined here. So more information on that is available and is coming, but it's beyond the scope of this. And since we really want to allow enough time for questions, I'm going to just move forward. Again, if there's a conflict, you feel like this is happening too much, or I don't like the approach they're using, or there's a problem with how behavior is being managed for your child from your perspective, then the first thing to do is to talk to the school about it, rather than going to more formal methods. I think sharing the concern and trying to do that based on facts that you have and an outcome that you're seeking. Those are really good strategies to go into a meeting and trying to take the emotion out of it if possible. Having been a parent who's been involved in these issues a long time ago, I know it is hard to leave emotion at the door, but I also found that those were my most productive meetings, to be honest. All of the other procedural safeguards that are available to students with disabilities, including mediation, state complaints, and due process complaints that require a due process hearing, those are all interventions that could also come into play here. All of those safeguards and procedures are detailed in special ed in plain language. And I know Alyssa will be putting the link to special ed in plain language in the chat. So if you want to learn more about those, you can.
I was just going to say the one other piece on the trying to resolve disputes, and Julie hit upon it in terms of, communicate with the district, is that I also think that we have to recognize that student challenges and behaviors are oftentimes not just exclusive to one environment, and that collaboration about home, school, understanding and collaborating in terms of medical or physical or other changes that may impact how a student responds or performs can really be instrumental in making sure that you have the right pieces or supports that can help prevent students from getting to that crisis level. And I think that sometimes that is one of the pieces that, we can address and support within the school day, but that, as Julie gave examples of parents letting people know that the child had a hard night at home, or there was some, issue that might have triggered them, knowing that you might be able to adjust or adapt the program or the support or the expectations to prevent hitting that crisis level. And that always goes back to, how do you avoid a crisis? You plan and you provide strategies, supports, and you try to preset for success, because if you fail to plan, you plan to fail.
All right, so we do have a number of resources with you with active links, and so we will be sharing that with you along with the slides from this PowerPoint at the end of the session. Right now, we are going to go into question and answer time.
Okay, and I did respond, and I think people have access to see the responses that I did put in, but I'm just going to sort of highlight a few of the ones I've answered. Or Julie, do you want to jump in on the ones that haven't been addressed yet? There's a couple of those.
I actually want to ask Alyssa if it is true that everybody can see the chat, because I did not think they could.
So everyone has access to enter information into the chat, and then responses will be sent to everyone, and then there's the Q&A box is available as well. We do have some questions in the chat that I believe only I am able to see, so whenever the two of you are ready, I'm happy to read some aloud as well.
Okay. So,
Okay. So
I was just going to say, some of these are relatively quick, so if you want me to just power through the ones that I addressed so far. One is, clarification on mechanical restraint as it relates to, vehicle safety. Is that something that needs to be, specifically prescribed? I would say that it should be something that's discussed at the CSE. It should be something that's appropriate and recommended by the CSE, and it may be related to, you know, a recommendation by the PT for physical support. It may be part of safety restraint as part of, you know, a student who has high likelihood of escape and, you know, running around, but it's not there as a mechanical restraint. It's got to be for the form and purpose of safety. So some districts have seatbelts on all buses and everyone uses them. Then that's no different for a child with a disability. These may be additional harnesses, securement, or other supports that may be unique to students with disabilities. That's where you have to be mindful as to whether or not it's a support or if it crosses to a mechanical restraint. Having comfy blankets and other tools, that's a support. Something that's tying them down and, you know, preventing them from moving, that may be one that we have to be careful about and make sure it's necessary and appropriate for their age and developmental status.
What other one did you answer? Because I can't see your answers either.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I didn't know that. One was if a child's in out of school suspension, do they have a debriefing meeting before the child returns? It's sort of discipline, but I will address it just because you can't condition or prevent a student's return based on debriefing where the family, you know, attends and participates. It's always advantageous, and I think it can be important to have that same vision. But you absolutely can meet with the student and preset and discuss expectations and provide a strategy and support to move forward to figure out how you're going to be successful and avoid that reoccurring. And then last, in terms of documentation of that debriefing, I would suggest districts include on their write-up form that they note that the debriefing occurred on date and time. I don't know that there's necessarily going to be a full write-up and summary of what occurred in that debriefing, but that's part of the bigger approach that the district has to determine how they're going to be monitoring the efficacy, the frequency of use, and whether or not they need to make any changes to training, staffing, supports, or planning to address if there is an increase or a concerning level of use of restraint or timeout in a setting or with certain people.
One question that I'm seeing here that I don't think we addressed was, where does this apply? Obviously, it applies in public schools, but where else does it apply? And it actually applies almost everywhere, in almost every type of school. So that includes like a BOCES setting. It would include any setting where a CSE, a Committee on Special Education, has placed a student. So it might be a private program, but the person was placed there by the CSE. It applies to in-state and out-of-state residential schools, as well as programs, in-state, out-of-state programs that a student may be in. So it applies in residential schools. It applies almost everywhere. I think maybe the only exception is if a parent unilaterally places a child like in a parochial school of some sort. It wouldn't necessarily apply there unless they were somehow being funded.
Private parochial and independent schools would not be subject to this unless they were also a state-approved program for a school placement.
That's a nice way of saying it. It also applies to charter schools.
Yes, but charter schools are considered public schools under education law. So they are always subject to the same 95% of the same requirements.
Okay. So next question, I'm just going through the questions in the Q&A, so I'm just going to go that way. Are students who are at juvenile or detention sites covered by these regulations? Yes, I would say, because they're operating a school.
It depends on whether they're in the school or out of the school, because that's where the center may have different parameters. During the school day, it's my understanding that would apply. But if they're in a facility that also has that individual outside of that, there's potentially the juvenile regulations may apply for the out of the quote unquote school day time. They have different regulations that still apply.
I think that raises a really interesting issue, though, that one that we've come across a few times for students placed in residential schools. Residential schools are subject to this, but sometimes those schools try to make a distinction between conduct, like a restraint of a student after school hours versus during the school day. In our position, and I think state ed's position would be, is there is no distinction there because we're recommending a student to that very restrictive setting of residential school because they need 24-hour education and support in order to make progress towards their goals. So I don't think we should be making that distinction. And I would say that in a residential school, all of these requirements are in place 24/7.
I agree there. I just think that the juvenile
Different.
juvenile justice detention center is a little bit different because of their oversight agency and the nature of the population that they may be serving.
I agree. The CSE is not recommending them to
No.
be there. Right. Different. Okay. Does the state ask to review school policies on timeout and emergency? Does the state, I'm not sure.
They don't necessarily have to ask us, but the districts are required to have those policies. And if there is a complaint or if there is an issue that arises, usually the first thing that they'll ask for is a copy of the district's policy in conjunction with their review of whether or not the district has complied with, timeout or restraint. So they may not be asking for it, but you need to have it. And that's something that the districts need to be ensuring that they do that. And yes, BOCES would need to have a policy because again, they're still part of the public school system.
Tara, these are a couple kind of situation specific, but I think they're good examples for people. So I'll ask them to you. Okay.
Sure.
How about the use of a cubicle within a classroom with staff sliding a door in front of it?
Okay, so a cubicle within the classroom, so long as the student is still able to participate and engage and they're not, precluded from accessing or participating in the instruction or peers, that may be just like a concentration focus. If they can exit and go back in and out of that voluntarily, I don't think that you're in a, timeout or restraint. The staff standing in front of door issue, I would need to understand the context. I mean, generally speaking, can staff stand in front of a door in the classroom? Sure. The issue is, if we're doing that as a means of, creating a lock or prevention of the exit and then what's going on. Would staff stand in front of the door when kids are lining up to go to the next activity? Yes. So that in and of itself is not the problem, but it may be the composition of when that's coming up and use of cubicle as to, are you standing at the door to the outer part of the cubicle to prevent the student from exiting? Then that might be, the difference.
Thanks. This other one, I think, we did cover, which is what about strapping a child into a chair and leaving them there? And that would obviously, would be a mechanical restraint that's forbidden because it's keeping the child from moving if they want to move. So if they want
unless it's a positioning or a support, again, there are, wheelchairs sometimes have stomach belts. They might have a student might have an SI belt and things like that. That's part of their physical, and support needs. That's permitted. And so you would potentially help them and make sure that those are appropriately fitted. And you might be stepping away while you're, providing instruction. If you're doing that and it is not part of their health, safety, or care plan, and it is designed specifically to restrict or prevent movement, that's when it goes into the mechanical restraint issue.
Another question, and we actually filed a state complaint on this issue last fall. Actually, Alyssa did, I think. But in any event, what if something's not called timeout? What if it's called the relaxation room or the calming room or that kind of thing? Do the timeout restrictions apply there? And, the answer there is really comes back to when is it being used and why is it being used? If it's being used regardless of what it's called, if it's being used as an emergency intervention because there's imminent harm, then it's a timeout. That's it. It's a timeout. But if it's a sensory room and it's being used for that purpose, student needs a break, wants to go to a different setting to calm down, student can go, leave volitionally, as Tara talked about, then that is, it's not a timeout. But it really doesn't matter what a school chooses to call something. It's why is it being used and how is it being used?
Right. And I think a lot of times we have cozy corners and comfy zones. And I think we've moved in a lot of areas to provide that within the classroom setting with the intent to avoid some of the need for students to exit and leave in order to access that type of support or strategy that we're teaching them to use. And I always look back to, are they able to access and participate in the instruction with their class, with their content? If they are, to me, that's, they're utilizing a strategy we may have taught them, and that's still engaged in the instruction. Once they're removed from that environment, then they have to be either using that location for implementation of a strategy or using a specific, approach that we've encouraged them to do, as opposed to just simply being removed.
Another person commented that they've never met a trained coworker in a community school. So who has to be trained? And that would be anyone
Right.
who's going to, everybody needs to get training now, all school staff, on de-escalation techniques in the school's policy regarding restraint, seclusion, and timeout. But if the person is going to be called upon or could be called upon to use a restraint, then that person would have to be trained. And I've seen some schools where the teacher, the classroom teacher, may have that training, and then there's other schools where only the principal or the assistant principal has that training. So I think each school sort of decides, but only those individuals can administer a physical restraint.
Right. And this goes back to where I said there's two levels of training, one for everyone, that, anyone in the district, should be aware of that policy and that practice and what your policy requires and the documentation requirements. But those who will be called upon to actually implement and monitor the use need to have the additional training on the de-escalation and other approaches and strategies.
Our day and residential programs hold on. Are the day programs the parties who are responsible for reporting? Okay, so for students, so who's responsible reporting for students who are in other programs? Is it the homeschool district, or is it, let's say, BOCES or the private school? Who does that reporting? Do you know, Tara?
They have the same obligation. I usually am in ongoing discussion with districts to make sure that there is a communication that not only to the parents, but also to the home district. But that is something that seemingly is a more organic arrangement. But that program is supposed to notify the family because they're subject to the same day reporting and 3-day documentation requirements. I would suggest that when a student is placed in an out-of-district program, whether it's day or residential, that there also be a plan or an agreement that the homeschool district will receive that information as well, because that may relate to their review of needs of the student, appropriateness of the program placement, and also their follow through with the family as well.
Someone asked here kind of in a two-part question, but it's saying, when did this go into effect? So I'm working with a family that never received any notification of restraints, either the documentation or a phone call or something else. And so that these went into effect last summer. So they have been in place this entire school year. So if the incidents you're talking about happen this school year, then it would appear that there may be non-compliance with the law. And my suggestion for that would be to request the information in writing. And I would request a meeting with the school as well to talk about the importance of receiving that information. And if it goes farther than that and there's still not compliance, I would talk to a regional associate at the special education quality assurance unit at the New York State Education Department.
Just to clarify the timing on this, the regulations were proposed on an emergency basis in March or April of last year. Then they were, there was review and feedback, and then they adopted them on an emergency basis at the end of July. Then the permanent adoption on a non-emergency basis went into effect in October. So there were 3 different timeframes, but it does apply the current school year. So hopefully districts are getting this, but I will, acknowledge that oftentimes the policy development does not happen as quickly as the obligation goes into effect, because districts' policy review requirements have certain number of readings that are required. And so when they adopt a regulation and require it to be immediately implemented, it doesn't necessarily factor in the legally required procedural compliance that the boards have to do in order to adopt and update those policies. That's just the joyous conundrum that districts have to, battle with. But ideally, everyone has the existing policies and should be adhering to them. And I continue to hope that at some point the state will do what several other states have done, which is created a statewide accepted or adopted practice for, restraint, try them out, and de-escalation training, where the state then picks those trainings up. That thus far has not happened. It would be a nice support for districts.
So if a child's behavior is escalating and deemed unsafe in the classroom, can the school or staff remove the child to another setting for weeks at a time?
If there are different times where there may be an agreed upon interim change of placement or program, which it is something that the parents and the district have come to agreement because a child might be in crisis, and we have an arrangement in place to ensure that the student is continuing to access their education, supports, and services. If you are just talking about the student is being, moved to one-on-one and is not accessing, and it's not part of a plan or an agreed upon support and service, then you're walking yourself into some dangerous territory there about denial of faith.
All right. There's a clarification about that chair, which I think we should. So the child's being strapped into the chair to keep them on task.
My default is typically that the fact that the child has a restraint belt on is not going to keep them on task. It's the internal motivation, it's the external support, it's the reminders, it's the guidance and, supervision that will help keep them on task and support. That, that strap might keep them from getting out of the chair or serve as a visual reminder, but there's got to be other approaches that could also be explored. Because if it's anything other than a visual reminder, then it does become a mechanical restraint to prevent the student's exit.
Okay. I'm trying to make sure that we are.
Yeah, I see there's one removed to another room and kept there all day. Again, there are still there are still in-school suspensions and other provisions pursuant to Education Law 3214. But, you also have to remember that when a student is removed pursuant to, education and discipline provisions, there are still educational obligations, and it may or may not rise to the level of, addressing the student's right to faith if that's happened more than 10 days in a school year, and you have manifestation determination and other obligations that need to be addressed as well.
We've got just a couple minutes left, and there's another question, which is really a good one that I think you might know, Tara. I don't know the answer. I'm curious. But before I say that, just as people are leaving, we do have an evaluation of this, and we really appreciate you completing the evaluation. It's helpful to us. And I'm going to ask for it, especially because I mentioned that we're putting that guide together, plain language guide on restraint and timeout rooms and alternatives. And your questions or comments or whatever is really helpful to us to know what to include in that guide. You know, you might have things that we're not thinking of. So I really would appreciate it if you would do that. And also include any topics you'd like to see for future lunch and learns. But please, please, please take the time to fill out an evaluation now or later. You will be sent one automatically by email. So the last question, which I think we're going to be able to take, is what about schools that contract with police officers as resource officers? Are they subject to the same restrictions on the use of restraint and timeout?
The answer is that unless they are utilizing an arrest, which is the only circumstance under which they are back in their police role, yes, the state has made that determination that they need to do that, which also means that we need to make sure that they understand the training and expectation. I understand and appreciate the role of SROs, and they can be incredibly helpful when it comes to a student in crisis. I'm always a little bit leery about the SRO having that lead unless we are at that point where, because there is a legal issue, they're going to immediately arrest the student. Other than that, the control and support and intervention with that student probably should be with the staff. That would be the guidance I would give to districts.
It's a good question, because I think the use of an SRO can go well in a lot of instances, but not well in others.
Right.
So,
and again, there are many SROs who do a wonderful job and are an incredible value to the district, and I don't want to in any way diminish that role. But again, that's not usually the situation that we're hearing about when a child is handcuffed, or removed. That becomes, a question of how did we get to that point? And I always say, you want the right people around to get to hopefully the outcome that is educationally appropriate and supportive of the student. But I do recognize we also have to balance that with safety, and it is a challenge for everyone. We do not have necessarily the holistic supports that all families and kids need, both in and out of school. And that has contributed to some of our challenges that we face both in school and that families and community members are dealing with out of school due to shortfall of programs, services, respite, other, care and design programs that are supposed to be providing some relief and alleviation, and the shortage of access to medical and mental health treatment continues to be our greatest barriers.
and on that sad but true note, I'm just going to take this moment to thank Tara for her time and insight, Alyssa for keeping us on track and taking care of the administrative details. I want to thank our captioner and our sign language interpreter, and wish you all a happy Valentine's Day if you celebrate it. If nothing else, maybe some sunshine today. We hope to see you at March at our next Lunch and Learn, which will be on annual review meetings, and our April Lunch and Learn, which is going to be on the state education, the special education quality assurance unit at NICED. So more information to come. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.